Imagine a Sunday in London, the late 17th century. People dressed in their finest clothes, powdered wigs, heading not to church, but to another far more popular destination. Pay a penny at the entrance, and get a ticket to the best show in town. A show where the main stars are living people, people in chains. This place was called the Bethlehem Royal Hospital, but everyone simply knew it as Bedlam. And it wasn't about treatment, it was a human zoo. Children were brought here to be shown what happened to those who misbehaved. Couples came for dates, to gawk, to laugh, to poke with a stick at those writhing on the straw. The air buzzed, screams, howls, incoherent babbling, the clanking of chains that bound patients to the walls, and above it all, the laughter and jeering of the well-fed, elegantly dressed public. Madness was considered contagious, not through the air, but through sin. These people in cages weren't sick. They were cursed, sinners punished by God, which meant their suffering was justice, and a humorous spectacle. In 1684, a new doctor walked through these gates. His name was Edward Tyson, a quiet, observant man with a piercing gaze. He wasn't an activist or a revolutionary. He was a scientist, an anatomist, a man accustomed to looking not at the surface but deep within, and he began his work at Bedlam. Every day he walked through the long, foul-smelling corridors, past cells where people sat in darkness and filth. He saw a woman who believed herself the Queen of England, dressed in rags. He saw a man who barked like a dog and ate from the floor. He saw a young man who for hours beat his head against the stone wall. And Tyson watched. He listened. He didn't see sinners. He didn't see animals possessed by the devil. He looked at them the way an anatomist looks at a complex, damaged mechanism. And he asked himself one simple question. Not, why are they being punished? But, what exactly is broken in them? Bedlam's keepers treated everyone the same. Cold baths until they turned blue. Bloodletting until fainting. Emetics to expel evil. And of course, beatings. If a patient was violent, they were beaten. If silent, they were beaten to make them speak. If speaking, they were beaten to make them silent. This wasn't medicine. It was taming. Edward Tyson went from cell to cell and did what no one had done before him. He talked to them. He asked their names. He listened to their delusional stories of conspiracies and kings. He tried to understand their logic. He saw in their eyes not divine retribution, but unbearable pain. And an idea began to form in his mind. An idea so wild and dangerous for that era that it was frightening to utter aloud. The idea that these people were not beasts. They were sick. And if they were sick, then they shouldn't be punished. They needed to be treated. To grasp this radical idea, one must understand the world in which it was born, a world where psychiatry didn't exist, where there wasn't even such a word. There was the medicine of the body, and it was as brutal as a butcher's trade. Doctors of that time believed that a human was a vessel containing four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. All our emotions, our character, our reason, everything depended on their balance. If you had too much black bile, you became melancholic. You'd sit in a corner, stare into space, mumbling about sins and death. If blood boiled within you, you were a maniac. You'd sing, scream, fight, imagine yourself Napoleon. The logic was as simple as an axe blow, and the treatment was the same. The balance had to be restored, at any cost. The doctor didn't arrive with medicine. He arrived with tools, a lancet to open a vein and drain excess blood, cupping glasses placed on the back to draw out the illness, and the most gruesome mixtures of herbs and minerals that induced vomiting or diarrhea. The body had to be purged, all evil expelled from it, through sweat, through blood, through filth. This wasn't merely a theory. It was dogma. Mental disorder was a physical problem, and it was solved physically. If a person was convinced they were made of glass and feared breaking, they were beaten with sticks to prove they were flesh and blood. If a woman refused to eat, believing herself a saint who didn't need sustenance, broth was forcibly poured down her throat through a funnel. The mind wasn't something separate. It was part of this dirty, imperfect bodily mechanism. And if the mechanism faltered, it was crudely repaired, like a village blacksmith mending a broken cart. No one tried to understand why a person thought or felt a certain way. That was unimportant. What mattered was to make them stop, to suppress the symptoms, to break the will of the illness, even if it meant breaking the person themselves. And into this world of blacksmiths came a watchmaker. Edward Tyson wasn't a doctor for the insane. He was one of the best anatomists of his time, a member of the Royal Society, a colleague of Newton and Boyle. His passion was structure. How did a monkey's paw work compared to a human hand? Why were a dolphin's fin bones so similar to fingers? He spent hours over dissection tables, with the finest scalpels and tweezers, taking nature apart to understand its design. He sought order in the chaos of flesh and bones. And so this man, accustomed to the silence of the laboratory, to precise incisions and strict diagrams, found himself in the heart of chaos. To him, Bedlam wasn't a hospital. It was another organism that needed to be dissected and studied. He saw in these screaming, thrashing people not sinners, but highly complex mechanisms in which the most crucial part had broken: the mind. And he wanted to understand exactly how it had broken. It was a challenge for his mind, as sharp as a scalpel. He began to keep records, detailed, meticulous: age, sex, history of each patient. What did they say? What did they fear? He cataloged their delusional ideas, their obsessive movements. He was an explorer in the wild, uncharted lands of human consciousness, and for a long time he maintained this detachment. He was a scientist observing a strange natural phenomenon, and then he saw it with his own eyes, not the aftermath, but the process itself. In one of the cells sat a young girl. She wasn't attacking anyone, wasn't screaming. She simply sat on the straw, quietly rocking, looking at her hands. Sometimes she whispered something, smiling at companions visible only to her. To the keepers, this was stubbornness, an illness unwilling to reveal itself, and they decided to shake her up. Two burly men entered her cell with a bucket of ice water. Tyson stood in the corridor. He saw the girl shrink in fright. How they grabbed her. He heard her thin, piercing shriek as the icy torrent cascaded over her head and shoulders. She struggled in their grip, gasping, and then went limp. They threw her, wet and trembling, back onto the dirty straw, and left, satisfied with their work. In that moment, everything changed for Edward Tyson. Scientific interest evaporated. Only a cold, quiet horror remained. He looked at this girl, at her wet hair, at the emptiness in her eyes, and he saw not a broken mechanism. He saw a human being who had been tortured, and the scientist within him died. That day, in Bedlam's dirty corridor, a doctor was born. He didn't go to his superiors. He didn't write complaints to the Royal Society. He returned to the corridors. But now he walked not as an observer. He walked as a hunter, and his prey was not illness. His prey was hope. He sought it in the darkest, most hopeless cells, and he found it. His name was James. He had sat in the corner of his cell for 7 years. He wouldn't eat unless food was forced down his throat. He didn't speak. He just sat, clutching his knees, staring at a single point. James was convinced he was made of glass, fragile, like ice on a spring puddle. Any touch, any sudden sound could shatter him into 1,000 pieces. The keepers treated him simply. They burst into the cell, grabbed him, and shook him, yelling in his face, "You're not glass, you're flesh!" James howled in terror, then fell silent again for weeks. He became even more motionless, even more like glass. Tyson began his experiment. He didn't enter the cell. He brought a small wooden chair and sat opposite the bars. He just sat. For an hour. Then another. Day after day. The keepers laughed at him. The patients howled. And he sat. He didn't stare directly at James. He looked somewhat to the side and spoke softly. He talked about the weather outside the window, about the gulls crying over the Thames, about the unappetizing porridge served for lunch today. He didn't ask questions. He didn't expect an answer. He simply filled the silence of the cell with his calm, steady voice. He created a world around James where there were no threats. After a week, he took the next step. He brought a pillow with him, soft, filled with goose down. He placed it on the floor in front of the bars. "James," he said, so quietly as if afraid to startle a bird, "I'll leave this here. It's a very soft thing. It cannot harm you." And he left. The next morning, the pillow lay in the corner of the cell, next to James. He hadn't touched it, but he allowed it to be there. And then Tyson made a decision. He asked the keeper for the key. The keeper chuckled, but gave him the key. Tyson slowly, creakily, opened the heavy door. He took off his hard-soled shoes and tiptoed inside as if entering a treasure vault. He moved so smoothly, as if floating on water. He stopped a few steps from James and sat on the floor, right on the dirty straw. They sat in silence. A minute, 10, 30. Tyson didn't move. He barely breathed. And suddenly James lifted his head. He looked not at Tyson, but at his bare feet, and then shifted his gaze to his face. No one had seen his eyes for 7 years, and in those eyes there was no madness. There was infinite inhuman loneliness. And then James spoke. His voice was creaky, like an ungreased hinge. He uttered just one word. Careful. In that moment, it wasn't just a wall between doctor and patient that collapsed. A wall between two worlds collapsed. Edward Tyson didn't cure the man of glass. He simply showed him that there were people who didn't want to break him. And for 17th century Bedlam, this was akin to a miracle. Tyson didn't stir. He merely nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly. He didn't rush to James with questions, didn't shout hooray. He accepted that word as a precious and fragile gift, and he responded to it not with words, but with action. He remained seated, motionless, safe. He showed that he had heard, and that he would be careful. From that day, he came to James's cell every day. They didn't have long conversations. Tyson brought food with him. He didn't try to force it into James. He placed the plate on the floor between them and ate himself. Slowly, calmly. He described what it was. Lentil soup, a piece of bread. He described the taste. And after a few days, James reached out and took his piece of bread. He ate it in tiny bites, as if afraid that a crunch would break him from the inside. This was the whole secret, all of his medicine. Edward Tyson had no drugs for madness. He had no theories about how the brain worked. He had something far more important. He had endless patience, and he accomplished something no one had ever thought of. He stopped fighting the illness. He began to cooperate with the person. He didn't try to pull James out of his glass world. He entered that world with him and began to live by its rules. If the world is fragile, move smoothly. If the world is full of threats, speak softly. If any touches pain, keep your distance. He didn't argue with the glass man. He became his first ally against everything else that wanted to break him. This was his main principle, the zero step he always took before starting any treatment: to accept the patient's reality, however wild it might seem, to accept it entirely, without judgment, without mockery. To the woman who believed herself the Queen of England, he bowed slightly upon meeting her. He never called her by name, only Your Majesty. And after a while the Queen began to speak with him, not about her subjects and palaces, but about how scared and lonely she was in that dark cell. To the man who believed he was being pursued by demons, Tyson didn't say that demons didn't exist. He asked what they looked like, where they hid. He brought a candle to illuminate the dark corners. He became an accomplice in the fight against invisible enemies. And the man, having an ally for the first time, began to trust him. It was still the anatomist at work. His dissection table had simply grown larger. Now it held not a dead body, but a living consciousness. He just as carefully, with the scalpel of his attention, separated one delusional idea from another. He sought their source. He tried to understand their internal logic. He mapped these alien, frightening worlds, and he did so with the same cold respect with which he dissected muscles and nerves. He did not judge. He studied. And in this detached, scientific curiosity, there was more humanity and compassion than in all the prayers and beatings of Bedlam. But such miracles do not favor witnesses, especially if those witnesses are accustomed to profiting from despair, not hope. Rumors about the strange doctor crept out of Bedlam's foul corridors like smoke from a fire. At first they were just sneers. Keepers recounted in taverns how a scholar from the Royal Society sat on dirty straw and conversed with madmen. He was laughed at. Then the rumors reached the ears of those who wore expensive wigs and considered themselves guardians of medical truth. The College of Surgeons. The professors whose lectures on the four humors students dutifully scribbled down. And they were not amused. For these men, accustomed to opening veins and cauterizing ulcers, Tyson's methods were not just strange, they were insulting. They devalued their entire craft. What did talking mean? What did accepting the patient's reality mean? It was charlatanism. It was old wives' tales. Illness was an enemy to be cut, poisoned, expelled from the body. And Tyson proposed, negotiating with it. One day a commission descended upon Bedlam. 3 doctors from the College of Surgeons. Important, pompous, in starched collars. They walked through the corridors, pinching their noses with perfumed handkerchiefs. They looked at the patients with the disdain of butchers assessing livestock. And they came to James's cell. Tyson was there. He was sitting on the floor. James, for the first time in many years, sat not in the corner, but closer to the center of the cell. Between them on the floor was a plate of oatmeal. They were silent. For Tyson, it was a victory. For the commission, a disgrace. One of the doctors, his face crimson with self-importance, jabbed a finger towards Tyson and hissed at the keeper. "What is this? Why is he on the floor? Why isn't he working?" To him, work meant screams, cold water, and blood. But he saw silence. Tyson was summoned to the hospital's board of governors. These were not doctors. They were officials. People for whom Bedlam was a source of income. The public paid money for a spectacle. And what spectacle was there in a doctor sitting quietly in a cell? Where were the screams? Where were the chains? Where was the madness that onlookers loved to gaze upon? They didn't understand his reports. He wrote about restoring trust, about reducing anxiety. But they saw empty columns next to the familiar words. Bloodlettings performed. Emetics administered. One of them, a fat wool merchant, waved Tyson's papers in the air. "Dr. Tyson," he rasped, "we don't pay you to befriend these creatures. We pay you to fix them, or at least pretend to. Your job is to maintain order, not to host tea parties." They demanded he return to proven methods. They threatened to revoke his practice. They called his approach dangerous. For if these people were acknowledged as human beings, then what? They couldn't be put on display for a penny. They couldn't be beaten. The entire system on which Bedlam rested would collapse. And in their eyes, Edward Tyson was not a savior. He was a destroyer. Tyson didn't argue. He didn't try to convince them. He listened silently to the accusations, nodded, and returned to the corridors. But now every step he took was monitored. The keepers reported his every word, every plate of soup he brought to a patient. He was under scrutiny, and he knew it wouldn't last long. They were setting a trap for him, and one day it snapped shut. The governors summoned him again, but this time there was no anger in their eyes. There was a cold, calculating triumph. "Dr. Tyson," said the same wool merchant, "we have a special assignment for you. A patient all your predecessors broke their teeth on. We want to see your lauded methods in action." He was led to the furthest cell in the dampest and darkest wing of Bedlam. A roar emanated from it, not a human scream, but a roar, a deep, guttural sound, full of fury, like a bear caught in a trap. Inside, on a short chain, a huge man thrashed. His name was Thomas. He had been a blacksmith until one day he decided he was the biblical Samson and smashed his smithy to splinters. Even 3 men feared approaching him. He threw food against the wall. He tore at his clothes. He growled at anyone who dared to glance into his cell. He wasn't just violent. He was a force of nature. Pure, uncontrollable power. And he was given to Tyson, like a bone given to a dog to see how it would gnaw it. This wasn't a test. It was a death sentence for his career. Tyson did the same as he had with James. He brought a chair and sat by the bars. Thomas roared and lunged at the bars so violently that the rods rattled. Tyson didn't even flinch. He just sat. A day, 2, a week. He listened. He listened not to words, but to the sound itself, the rhythm of that roar, the intonations of that fury. He, the anatomist, dissected the sound, and he understood. It wasn't just anger. It was the pain of a cornered beast. On the 8th day, he didn't come empty-handed. He brought a large, raw piece of beef, bloody, with sinews. He didn't try to push it through the bars. He opened the door. He walked inside. The keeper behind him crossed himself. Thomas froze, then prepared to spring, chain taut. His muscles bulged. Tyson didn't look him in the eyes. He placed the meat on the floor, exactly in the middle between himself and the growling man, and sat, right on the floor. He didn't say a word. He simply showed, I am not an enemy. I brought you food, the kind of food a beast eats. An hour passed. 2. Thomas didn't move. He only watched. The man, the meat. And then slowly, very slowly, he crawled towards the piece of beef. He tore at it with teeth and nails. He ripped it apart like a wolf tearing its prey. Tyson sat and watched, without fear, without disgust. When the governors came for their inspection a month later, they found an incredible sight. Tyson was sitting on the floor in the cell. Thomas sat opposite him. He was no longer chained, and gnawed oxtail lay between them. Thomas looked up at the newcomers. There was no longer bestial rage in his eyes, only infinite weariness. He looked at Tyson and spoke, the first human word in 3 years. More. The governors were silent. The wool merchant opened his mouth, but couldn't utter a sound. They had come to see failure, and they saw a miracle. They wanted to break the doctor, but he had mended a man. On that day, the era of tamers ended in Bedlam, and the era of doctors began. But no miracle occurred. The governors didn't rush to embrace Tyson. The wool merchant didn't donate his fortune for soft pillows for the patients. They were businessmen, and they saw not the healing of a soul, but the solution to a problem. Thomas no longer broke the bars. James no longer refused food. The Queen of England no longer howled at night. Bedlam became quieter, and thus easier to manage. They didn't care how he did it. They cared about the result, and they gave him what he wanted. Not money, not fame. They gave him the freedom to act. The keepers were ordered not to interfere with the strange doctor, and this changed everything. Before Tyson, Bedlam treated with chains, ice water, and a fist, the tools of a tamer. After him, the main medicine became a chair, a pillow, and a piece of bread, the tools of a human. Before him, patients were looked at to find the devil within them. After him, patients began to be scrutinized to find the child within them. Frightened, lost, huddled in the furthest corner of their own mind. Before him, the question was, how do we make him shut up? After him, the question became different. Why is he screaming? This doesn't mean Bedlam transformed into paradise. No, the walls remained the same. The filth and stench didn't disappear. The public still paid their penny at the entrance to gawk at others' misery. But something broke in the very essence of the place. Tyson didn't write a single book about his methods. He didn't create a school of psychiatry. He was an anatomist, and he simply did his job. He dissected not the body, but suffering. And he showed others a simple thing, a thing that seems obvious today, but then sounded like heresy. He showed that the mind is not a monolithic block, either whole or shattered to pieces. He showed that the mind is a delicate web, and if one thread breaks, the entire structure trembles and distorts. But it can be mended, not by brute force, which tears neighboring threads, but by a patient, gentle movement that finds the broken end and ties it back into place. He didn't cure everyone. Many remained in their glass castles and imaginary kingdoms. But he changed the very air of Bedlam. He proved that conversation could be stronger than beatings, that patience could be more effective than emetics, that human warmth could provide comfort even where icy terror seemed to have taken permanent residence. He didn't find a cure for madness. He found the human in madness, and that proved far more important. And gradually Bedlam began to sound different. Before, it was a cacophony of pain, a continuous multi-voiced scream that never subsided. Now, through the howls and mumbling, other sounds increasingly broke through. The doctor's quiet, steady voice, the creak of the chair he moved to another set of bars. Sometimes, a timid, barely audible reply from the darkness. The keepers, who once carried sticks, now carried pillows and plates of food for Tyson. They still didn't understand what he was doing, but they saw the result. And fear of the violent madman gradually gave way to a grumbling respect for the strange doctor who could calm them with his mere presence. He left no textbooks behind, no instructions for talk therapy. He didn't even think of himself as creating something new. He was still the same anatomist. He simply dissected despair as meticulously as he dissected the muscles of a chimpanzee. He sought structure, logic, cause. He worked within those walls until his death in 1729. Until his last day, he walked those corridors, sat on his small chair, and listened. He listened to stories of glass people, of exiled kings, of demons hiding in the shadows. He listened to the delusions that everyone else considered meaningless noise. And in this lay his entire secret, his great discovery, which he himself perhaps never fully realized. For centuries the world tried to outshout madness, to suppress it, to beat it into submission with sticks and ice water. Edward Tyson was the first to understand a simple truth. Madness is not something to be silenced. It is something to be listened to the very, very end.